Hello and happy Friday. I believe I'm live. I'm not quite sure whether I am or not yet, so give it a few moments. If anyone's watching, hello. Lovely to see you, or be with you, sorry, I should say, on this very cold, miserable autumnal day. I can't. Oh, brilliant. We've already got 14 people watching. Hello, hello. Hi, Anya. Hello, lovely to see you. Nice and prompt. We'll give it a few more moments as we normally do. Yes. Hi, William. Yeah, I'm feeling a bit better today. I've been a little bit ropey this week. I even took the extra precaution of doing a COVID test on Monday, which wasn't fun, but I'm pleased to say I'm officially COVID free. Just had a nasty case of autumnal flu. I think lots of people tend to get it around this time of year as the seasons are changing. And anyway, yeah, so apologies for my eye bags and my slightly croaky voice. I'm feeling much better, thank you, and very glad to be speaking to you all today. Um, Hello, Nicole. Hello, William. Hello, Victoria. Hello, Ivy. Hello, Kelly. Hello, Linda. Feeling much better, thank you. Hello, Ian. Hello, Rosie. Hello, Georgia. Hello, Dawn. Hello, Christy. Hello, Alison. Is this because you brought a storm to the south of England? It could well be. It could well be. Ellie is in the comments. Thank you very much for joining, Ellie. And actually, I'm going to embarrass Ellie now. If any of you want to wish Ellie a belated happy birthday, she celebrated quite a significant one on Wednesday. So happy birthday to Ellie. Oh, good morning, Wendy in Dallas. Hello from North Wales in lockdown. Oh, sorry to hear that. Hello, Paul. Oh, lovely to see you all. I'm going to dive straight in because there's a good number of you already watching, and we have quite a bit to talk about today. Oh, hello from Massachusetts. Sorry for the rain. I was singing along to Queen while doing some housework. Well, that's a fantastic excuse, and I do not blame you for one bit. I frequently do the same. I Want to Break Free is the perfect choice to sing along to while doing your housework. Well, anyway, what are we talking about today? Well, today is Friday, which means it's Findmypast Friday, which means more new records. We add them to the site every single week. This week is no different. And we've got two particularly interesting collections to talk about today with a fascinating history behind them. So I wanted to have a quick look at what we've added on the site. A fascinating, genuinely fascinating and often forgotten chapter of Black British history, because of course we have just begun Black History Month in the UK. We at Find My Past are taking this as a big opportunity ourselves to learn more about Black British history. It's a subject I'm ashamed to say I was quite ignorant of until I've started doing a deep dive. And I've found out so much so far that what I just wasn't aware of, and it's completely changed my perceptions, made me realise that Black British history is just British history, and it goes back way further than you'd expect. And there are so many interesting individuals, instances, aspects that I wasn't taught in school, and I've really enjoyed taking the time to read about. So we'll be taking a quick look at that, primarily the Sierra Leone settlement scheme and the Commission for Black Poor in London. So we'll be taking a look at those really historically rich records that have come from the National Archives. Fresh for you to explore over the weekend. Also, huge thanks to everybody who tuned in to Jen's live broadcast yesterday, the live unboxing of all those family heirlooms. If you missed it, it's up on our Facebook page. I might be on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it there as well. But yeah, it was a special experience seeing Jen get quite emotional and share all these precious heirlooms with us. But some of the questions that came up quite frequently were questions around organising and storing your research. So I figured, those are some helpful tips and tricks that should apply to everybody watching. So we'll have a quick look at those, and then to finish things up, a little bit of fun for the weekend, following the recent news that Tom Hardy is the bookies' current favourite to replace Daniel Craig as the next James Bond. I thought that would be a great opportunity to do some celebrity research and do a bit of a deep dive into Tom Hardy's family tree. We've found out loads, and it's just a great case study to show that everybody has something in there. There are stories in everybody's family tree. Tom Hardy's is no different. We've actually found a load of different stories. And the surprising fact that really, according to his paternal line, Tom shouldn't even be Tom Hardy. He should be Tom Egmore. But we will look at that in a little bit more detail towards the end. So just to recap, we're going to start off by taking a look at the fascinating new records we've added this week, the amazing history behind them. Then we will have a quick look at some tips for cataloguing, organising and preserving your family history research. And to finish up, a little bit, some tales from Tom Hardy's family tree. I must admit, I'm a big fan of Tom Hardy and I wouldn't mind him taking over as James Bond from Daniel Craig. I think he'd make a fantastic James Bond. Any Bond fans out there who've got any recommendations of their own, pop them in the comments. Could be a bit of fun. So a quick look at some of the comments before we dive in and get into the meaty stuff. Oh, thank you, Andrew. Said, read your CEO statement, and it shows why I'm so impressed in the site. Thank you very much. Yeah, our CEO put a statement out recently about Black History Month in the UK and what we're doing to increase our own understanding and everybody else's in the process. Yeah, something we're very proud to be involved with. And I mean, we're only 2 days in, and I've already learned so much. Rosie Murrell, Sierra Leone records are great to see. Read about this only recently with David Olusoga. It's a great addition. Thank you. We're great to have, really pleased to have them up on the site, and I've loved reading about the history of them, and I'm looking forward to telling you about it. So I'll get cracking. Gian Jones Strabers, do you know how annoying it is to watch someone in a video reading the screen in front of him and saying hello? Oh, sorry, Jane. Sorry to hear you're not impressed. And you're saying, really interesting story from Fife of a black slave who brought over here to be, who went through the courts to become a free man. Coal miners in the area made money to help with his legal battle. That does sound incredible. I'd love to hear a bit more about that. William Shaw saying that about yesterday's broadcast, the box, all those hidden things, and the view aren't might have stuff too. I think just recapping on what we did yesterday. Andrea Crusoe, hello from Nova Scotia. Hello, Andrea. Gillian, my adopted cousin found his birth father and mother last year, and now the daughter he gave up himself 30 years ago has just got in touch. This DNA stuff is crazy. It really is, and it's knocking down, I guess you could call them brick walls, but gaps in knowledge every single day, and the technology is moving at some would say, an alarming rate. So who knows where we're going to be in 10 years' time. Lots of people saying it's cloud and rainy. Yeah, in the UK here, it's pretty miserable. October's definitely upon us. So I've got my warm sweater on, heating's on, and I think that's why I've been a bit ill. Anyway, let's dive straight in. So we've got 2 questions of the week this week. If you're tuning in for the first time, we ask these at the start of every video to facilitate conversation and just get the ball rolling. This week's 2 questions of the week are: 1, as we're looking at Tom Hardy's family tree, are any of you related to anyone famous? They don't have to be incredibly famous, and were they locally famous? You basically just tell us about your interesting, noteworthy ancestors. I think my probably most noteworthy one is the one I've told you about loads of times before, who's my great-great-great-grandfather, who was MP for Kingston and Richmond, which is the area I now live in. And our second question of the week is, what tips do you guys have for storing, organising and sharing your family history with your relatives? It's useful skills that apply to everybody, and we can always do at getting better at them. We've already had a few people send submissions in. So William Shaw, hero as always, said, question of the week. Question 1, his famous relative is his 4th great-uncle's son, Sir Thomas Wardle, who was a big player in the textile industry, or his 11th great-grandmother, Elizabeth Launcelin, who married Randall Green of the Paulton Launcelins. They sound like an interesting family. And he's coming with 2 fantastic points for the second question. He said, always study things carefully. A place passed down could mean a road name. Story was someone died in Canterbury, no record found, but the family did live on Canterbury Road, which was some confusion in his research. And question of the week part 2, if someone disappears, look overseas, but look at the info very carefully. That's very good advice, as often place names were taken with the settlers. So Portland, Dorset could be recorded as Portland, Ohio, or Portland, Oregon, etc. So basically, if someone disappears, take a look very carefully at the info you find about them overseas and just triple check that. Someone with a great name of Cosmic Chervil said, not too sure about tips, but for question number 1, one of my famous ancestors was Thomas Challoner, the headmaster of Shrewsbury School. Actually, Shrewsbury School was where the celebrated war poet Wilfred Owen, and a personal hero of mine, was educated. So Thomas Challoner was the headmaster of Shrewsbury School from 1636 to 1645, and he was sent away during the Civil War before returning to his permission as headmaster again. Kimberly Thompson said, no direct ancestor, but William Sancroft was the 79th Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a second cousin to an 8th great-grandfather. That counts, Kim. You can include him. And she said, for question 2. Since starting my research several years ago, I have learned to question everything. Never take written records for granted, especially with ancestors. Also a great point. With many written records, I say this a lot, but the information you see is often only as reliable as the person who submitted it in the first place. And Amanda Webb, as usual, has shared loads of great stories. Amanda has an incredible family tree with some really great ancestors, so I won't go through them all. But she, for example, her great-grandmother's first cousin was William Harold Coltman. He was the most decorated non-commissioned officer of World War I, receiving the Victoria Cross and others. Also, her 11 times great-grandfather, wow, that's a long way back, Francis Herrick, was Francis Herrick's first cousin, was Robert Herrick, the poet. Gather thee rosebuds. You do have some incredible ancestors, Amanda. And she's shared loads of great tips as well. Ask older relatives what they know before you start. Great tip, especially people in photographs. Make notes and store them safely. Storing safely is always important. Always list your sources and evidence. I fell foul of this so many times when I first started out. It's so exciting to find the next piece of information that you can go to loads of pains to note all the information down about the individual, but not the actual resource you found it in. And if you want to revisit that and expand on it, it can be a blooming nightmare if you haven't made a note of exactly where that information came from. Great advice as always. And my favourite piece of advice, Amanda said, don't give up on brick walls and let them put you off this wonderful hobby. Probably the best tip of all. Concentrate on other parts of your tree and come back to your brick wall. New records are being added all the time. It does require patience and hard work, but it's worth it when you find the answer. Make notes on what you've discovered so far and what information documents you still require. I couldn't have said it better myself. I often like to say that every day is a better day than yesterday for family history because there's more aligned, more to discover, and Amanda summed that up perfectly. So, brilliant. Lovely to see everybody chatting away in the comments. In the interest of time, I'm going to dive into this week's new records. So, what have we got this week? So, for everybody who wants to know a little bit more about exactly what we've added this week, just visit the What's New section of our blog. I am sure Andy Lister, Alex, Future Bond or Future Blonde Villain, either or. I think I'd make quite a good Bond villain, actually. Not so much a great Bond. I don't think I'm quite as athletic enough. Anyway, what was I saying? So, yeah, if you want to know more about the new records we add, visit the What's New section of our blog. We post a Findmypast Friday update every single week. It'll take you straight to those collections and give you all the information you could possibly require. So, what have we added this week, 2nd of October 2020? So before I look at the big two collections, I wanted to look at the history behind. Quick summary, we've added over 19,000 additional burials from 3 Devon cemeteries, 2 in Tavistock, 1 in Plympton. Really great to see that we're adding more records to our Devon collection. We're very proud of our Devon collection. I'm fairly confident in saying we have one of the best, I think we do have the best collection of Devon parish records available online, and it continues to grow. So great for all those of you who are looking to find the final resting place of your Devon ancestors. We've also added loads of new newspapers. We've added 3 new titles: Stratford Express, Flintshire County Herald, and the Principality, which is a Cardiff newspaper covering 1880. But we've also added thousands of, I think 95,000 new pages to brand about 15 existing titles that are already in the archive. If you want to know exactly what's covered in that update, visit the blog and you will find all the information you could possibly require, as well as handy links to those papers so you can search them straight away. We've also expanded our Caribbean Marriage Index. I always like to highlight these because traditionally Findmypast was we really kind of only covered the US, North America, Australia, New Zealand. Oh, sorry, my phone is ringing. I'm going to hang up. Sorry, where was I? Yeah, we traditionally mainly covered North America, Australia, New Zealand, the British Raj, so like British India. But as of last year, we started expanding and diversifying our collections with loads of new records from the Far East, Caribbean, South America, Middle East, Indian subcontinent. And this is the latest installment of that. So we've added 15,000 new marriage records from Barbados, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. These go all the way back to 1591, and if you've got Caribbean roots, they're a must try. Anyway, the two big collections I wanted to talk about this week are the two that we've got from the National Archives to mark the start of Black History Month. The first is London Black Poor 1786, and these records basically record the details of destitute Black Londoners. It's a small but intriguing collection, I think it's fair to say, that does offer a rare glimpse of this kind of forgotten chapter of London history, really. So to kind of set the scene, over the course of 1785, it became apparent to the authorities that increasing numbers of Black people were living in severe poverty in London, many of them on the streets, and they had little to no means of official support, really. While some of these were distressed mariners, former mariners from the merchant service and the Royal Navy, a significant proportion of them were actually Black loyalists who'd been evacuated from the American colonies or the newly formed United States following Britain's defeat in the American Revolutionary War. Quite a substantial amount were evacuated to Nova Scotia, the West Indies, and London. And when they got to London, they fell on hard times. These were desperate people who'd fled a war, and little to no support was offered. And this was noticed. Great sympathy was felt for the plight of these people. Initially, support arose as a matter of private charity. It basically began with two concerned shopkeepers, a London baker and a London bookseller, who started organising charity to help these poor folks on the streets. But by 1786, into the next year, this is expanded, and a broader group of affluent and influential figures. Amongst them, you had abolitionists, Quakers, who were always big on philanthropy, and others, started this formalised committee for relief, as they called it, Committee for the Relief of Black Poor. And it was an irregular kind of benefits, really. They provided food, financial support out of two locations, the public houses, the White Raven in the East End and the Yorkshire Stingo in the West End. They also provided a sick house in Fitzrovia for those who were desperately ill. And the history of this scheme is actually intrinsically tied to the next record collection we published this week, which is the the Sierra Leone Resettlement Scheme, 1787. That's just the title, sorry, just 1787. So basically in 1787, the British government ran a program that aimed to settle some of these destitute Black people who were suffering in extreme poverty in London in Sierra Leone, which was then a British colony. And these records document the passengers who set sail on these voyages. And it's a piece of history I'd never heard about. I knew nothing about this, and it was fascinating. So I'll give you a quick recap of what I've discovered. So what exactly was the scheme? What were the intentions behind it? Was it a shameful attempt to deport Black people from the shores of Britain, or was it a charitable attempt to promote self-reliance or offer people a leg up? Well, it's complicated, but I think it's fair to say the answer is a little bit of both. So, as I've already touched on, there were increasingly large numbers of ex-sailors, runaway slaves, because at that time, slavery was not legally recognised on British soil. So any escaped slaves who made it to Britain were legally free. So you had large numbers of runaway slaves, you had large numbers of ex-sailors, you did have some out-of-work domestic servants, but as I said, a lot of them were loyalists who'd fled the American colonies following Britain's defeat at the Revolutionary War. So after philanthropists, as we've already touched on, discovered the plight of these poor people and commenced an effort to aid them, the committee that we've already discussed, the Committee for Relief of the Black Poor, was set up and distributed food, hospital care for the sick, some of these people were genuinely very ill. So one chap, for example, a chap called Jonathan Strong, who can be found in records in around 1765, who was desperately ill, was too sick for the sick house at Fitzrovia, and he was sent to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and his medical expenses were covered by the committee. So a little bit of that also happened. So as well as trying to aid people by providing them healthcare, financial support, and food, the committee also helped to wish those who wished to return to sea or other countries if they didn't want to remain in Britain. So after a while, the committee and their supporters became somewhat supported by the government. The Sierra Leone scheme was proposed as a way of resettling some of these people in Sierra Leone, and the view was not only would it offer support to these people and alleviate the homelessness problem in London, it would also help populate the west coast of Africa. The people that they sent over, many of them being loyalists, they believed would be able to establish industry and useful trade links and basically advance the agenda of the British Empire. And at first, the scheme was basically supported by everybody. It was supported by the government, it was supported by the philanthropists, and it was supported by the poor themselves, but for completely different reasons. So the government were more than happy to get rid of homeless people, as they always had been. So they contributed enormous sums of money to sustain them before, during, and after their departure. I'm sure there was also a little bit of racism and xenophobia that contributed to the position as well. The philanthropists had truly charitable concerns and wanted to keep people from literally dying on the streets of London. And the poor themselves also wanted to find a place where they could establish a working community and support themselves independently. They were proud people who wanted to support themselves and have their own community. While some of them could see that the government's motives weren't entirely benign, for them, anything was better than slavery or starvation, and the opportunity to found a colony themselves must have seemed like a heaven-sent solution. So initially, the committee and the government's plan was to establish a colony in Nova Scotia, but this fell through in 1786. And then an interesting man by the name of Henry Smeaton appears on the scene. I really should close my emails because I'm getting emails and it's distracting me. So yeah, this man, Henry Smeaton, stepped into the picture. He was a businessman, a botanist, and a bit of a conman. And he offered this vision of a self-sufficient and lucrative colony, which delighted the committee and everyone he sold it to. He himself had actually lived on the west coast of Africa and claimed it was entirely habitable, which was obviously prime importance to the prospective settlers who read his short proposal when he distributed it a year later in a handbill. Basically, Smeaton told everyone what they most wanted to hear. So he sent this memorandum to the Lord Commissioners of His Majesty's Treasury, presenting his scheme as a viable solution to, and you know what the solution was. It was to transport the poor to Sierra Leone, give them 3 months' provisions, clothing, bedding, tools, and medicine, everything he said was required to build a self-sufficient colony. Once there, he said they'd build housing themselves, they'd become self-sufficient and quickly begin to supply Britain with various raw materials, establish these trade links. And he worked out this plan in incredible detail. He listed everything meticulously: clothes, food, supplies, medicines, everything that would be needed. However, he also worked in quite a lot of lies. He lied about the climate of Sierra Leone. He completely lied about the relations with the local chieftains. He completely lied about the continued dangers of passing slave ships and a load of other things. But of course, everybody wanted to hear the lie he was selling. So in their haste to accept such a relatively straightforward solution, neither the committee or the government did that much investigating. They took it at face value, which proved to be pretty disastrous. Had they actually dug into it, they would have discovered two facts. First, that Smeaton himself had testified to a government commission only 1 year earlier that the climate of Sierra Leone was so dangerous that if a convict station were to be set up there, he estimated 100 would die each month. No one wanted to check that. He only said it a year prior. Second, that he and his associates had actually intended to establish a profit-making estate there using slave labor. So it's fair to say Smeaton's intentions were not pure. So really, these poor people were being ushered into a rather deadly trap. And the honest anti-slavery activists and philanthropists were sadly happy to believe Smeaton, and the government may have colluded. We don't know if they did or not caring how this perceived problem of increased homelessness disappeared. And and apparently, according to some researchers, the government was so desperate to fill the ships going over that some were even coerced into going. While large numbers did eagerly volunteer to join the colony, some were more or less coerced, because persuasion was starting to meet with doubts amongst the poor people targeted for this scheme. After a while, they did start to fear being targeted by slavers once they were in Africa. And the longer the plan went forward, more and more potential recruits fell prey to these doubts and demanded better preparations or support before they agreed to go. And really, as we said, a lot of the people being sent over were already in a poor physical condition. These were poor, desperate homeless people, starving in many cases. And this kind of hindered the plan from the start. You could almost say it was over before it began. And Henry died before it reached completion. He died in 1786. And it would have been much better for the colonists if the plan had died with Smeaton, but sadly it didn't. Alternative plans did come through for other sites, but a number of the black leaders chosen to lead the expedition decided to stick with Smeaton's plan. They'd come so far, and they were completely unaware that a lot of it was based on fantasy. So they actually petitioned the committee to carry it through when there were certain delays, saying, come on, this is our one chance, let's do this. And all doubts about this settlement on the African coast were effectively submerged. And it's at this point that a very interesting chap, a name you've probably heard of before, Aluda Aquino, known in England at the time as Gustavus Vassa, who was a very well-known abolitionist, campaigner, author, all-round fascinating chap. I didn't realise this, but he was actually appointed as the head of the committee at this time. And his job was to supervise the preparations, as well as act as an intermediary between the settlers, the committee, and the government. And he willingly took this job, wanting to help his people. And he was, poor him, he had no idea of the frustrations and dangers that he was taking on in this role. So Aquino himself had been born in Africa. He was taken into slavery as a child. He'd served on board loads of ships and eventually freed himself and made it to England, where he became this famed activist, writer, and orator. Very, very talented orator by all accounts. And he toured the country speaking at abolition meetings. He'd met with radicals, lived with Democrats. He was a very well-connected, very respected man. And he wrote his autobiography in 1789, which is on my list of reading. But when he arrived in London after a trip to Philadelphia in 1786, he learned, that's when he first heard of Smeaton's plan and the Sierra Leone scheme. And far from seeing it as an opportunity to rid Britain of unwanted homeless people, he agreed with it. He pronounced at the start, he said that he was agreeably surprised that the benevolence of government had adopted the plan of some philanthropic individuals. So with his kind of combination of fierce abolitionism and his enthusiasm for mercantilism, he believed the plan offered independence for the settlers and a possibility for England to develop commerce with Africa in goods rather than people. So he thought this was an opportunity to change the nature of England's relationship with Africa. So he thought this could be a great thing to do. He knew some of the members of the committee already. They'd actually approached him to take on the role of superintendent. And at their recommendation, and after several interviews with the Navy Board, he was appointed commissionary to put in charge of making sure all the supplies were provided, loaded, ordered, and all the boxes were ticked and everything was going smoothly. But pretty soon on, he himself saw this. It wasn't all. It wasn't all it appeared to be, basically. He started writing to his friends that he suspected the colonists would be used, in his own words, as they are in the West Indies and betrayed into slavery and death. His attempts to improve conditions aboard the ships preparing to embark for Africa, and for the conditions when they arrived, resulted in basically him being accused of stirring the settlers up to resist and cause trouble. And in the end, even though the Navy Board found he'd acted in good faith, he was sacked from the role, and the scheme went ahead. So even after all these disasters, they didn't cancel it. They went ahead and they set sail from Plymouth, and it was a terrible voyage. Of those who set sail from Plymouth, only 2/3 survived the first 3 months, which gives you an idea of how bad conditions were on board and how poor the preparations were. When they got there, things were even worse. As you would imagine, the native peoples weren't particularly pleased to see this new colony appear in their back garden. The supplies provided were not sufficient. Disease was rife. Starvation was affected. The medicine provided was very bad. The settlers basically had to live on salt food and rum, sleeping in soggy tents. And of course, many of them fell ill and died. Eventually, the white supervisors who'd been sent to oversee it completely abandoned them. They just left. And they refused to take settlers with them who wanted to leave, completely abandoned them. And by March 1788, only 130 of the original settlers were left. The rest had either died or fled the colony. And then further problems continued. Whereas Thomas Aquinas was completely correct. The slave trade was continuing. It was alive and well at that time, and slave ships did not like having this independent black community in their slaving territory. And captains and crews would often capture settlers. And yeah, the settlers sometimes retaliated by tracking down and punishing kidnappers, which would infuriate the captains and lead them to, and that led them to basically encourage one of the local leaders, a chief known to the slavers as King Jimmy, to oppose the settlement. And yeah, it was an absolute disaster. They were completely betrayed. And even eventually, an English ship, the HMS Panoma, was sent to protect the settlers, but its captain, a man named Henry Savage, simply watched from the deck as the settlement was attacked. He only went ashore to bury the dead. He refused the settlers' pleas again to carry them to safety and sailed away without them on the 3rd of December. 3 days later, the main area of the settlement, Granville Town, was burnt to the ground. Relief did not arrive for a full year until January 1791, and from that time on, the colony's problems persisted. Continued attempts to prop it up or prolong its existence failed miserably, and it was only thanks to the efforts of black activists and anti-slavery abolitionists which managed to establish another colony in Sierra Leone, mainly consisting of settlers who'd previously been sent to Nova Scotia, that led to the establishing of the modern country of Sierra Leone. So there you go. I thoroughly enjoyed learning about that. It was a piece of, it's not a particularly pleasant chapter of history, but it's a fascinating one and something I was completely unaware of. So there's your history lesson for the day. That's the history behind the records that we have added today. So I'm going to have a quick look at some of the comments. Miko saying, always make a note of your source so that when you go back and check again, when you add something to your family tree, you never know how many times a new piece of evidence might mean you have to come back and really evaluate what you've already done. 100%. Alan saying, I'd like Henry Cavill as James Bond, or to reprise the role of Napoleon Solo. Actually, Henry Cavill would be a great James Bond. I think he's a great actor, actually. Basil Rathbone, aka Sherlock Holmes, is a distant cousin of Alan Bennett. Oh, wow. It's a great celebrity anthem. Ancestor. Julie Stanfield, thank you, Julie, saying we have the best collection of Devon records. We're very proud of it. And Adina Franks is right now tracing a line on the Royal Hamiltons, Earls and Kings, related to Queen Mary of Scots. Wow. So it sounds like loads of you have some interesting ancestors. Andrew Davis, Edwin Lewis Benbow, that's a good name, Military Cross, who was one of only 2 people to force Baron von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Oh, I've heard of him, to crash land in World War One. He has a Wikipedia page too. I've read it. Wow, that's amazing. That's a great one, Andrew. Thank you very much for sharing. Tracy McNamara, my brick wall is, I recently discovered my father had a sister who was given up after birth, but not adopted. I can't find any records of her from her registered birth till she leaves the UK for the USA. Any help would be appreciated. Well, I'm sure you're in the right place. I'm afraid I don't think I could, off the top of my head, I don't have any advice to offer, but one of the lovely things about this video, one of these broadcasts, is the amazing little community we've built up and some really helpful and very knowledgeable people. So if you do have questions, just like Tracy, do feel free to answer them here. You may well get an answer that could help you. Amanda Webb, there is a TV show, Black and British Forgotten History by David Olusoga. Olusoga. I always get it pronounced his name wrong. It's on BBC iPlayer. I highly recommend it. Learn much. Yeah, I recommend that too. I've watched a bit of it and it's fantastic. Well, everything David does is amazing. I need to read some of his books. That is a great recommendation as well. Laurie McNamara in the States, Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone is my husband's fifth-time great-grandfather through his daughter Lavina. Loads of great comments here. Thank you so much to everybody who's sharing. So many I can hardly keep track, actually. Kelly McDonald's, my great-grandfather's brother-in-law was called Mark Jacobs. I doubt he is the Mark Jacobs, but I'm going to have a look out of interest. Maybe you could get a discount. I know my wife would like a discount with Mark Jacobs. And Heidi Daniels, my mum had a relative called John Howland. That's a name I recognise. That's why. Who went to America on the Mayflower. You can trace his line back really far. He has kings of France and an important German descendant. He has many famous descendants, such as Churchill, Roosevelt, Nixon, Humphrey Bogart, and George Bush. That's a fantastic mix. Well, as so many of you have been sending all these wonderful tips for organising, capturing your research, I'll give you a few of my own. So one of the things that I help is step one, just reevaluate your current methodology. So you're probably working with a mix of paper and digital. Maybe you're using ring binders and your computer concurrently. But basically, just review your current method of organizing and ask yourself a few key questions. So, like, do you prefer paper or digital files, or are you happy to keep organizing both? Do you have enough space to store your physical paper files? I know if I had enough material, if I had as much material as Jen does, my wife would kill me because our little flat would fill up very, very fast. Can you afford to purchase an additional hard drive for extra storage, or cloud storage, which a lot of people recommended yesterday, such as William cloud storage? I would always recommend. You never know what acts of God could occur, and it would be dreadful if, say, fire, flood, or earthquake resulted in you losing all these precious family heirlooms. At least if they're in the cloud, they're there forever. And also, how computer literate are you? Do you have the skills needed to manage all these digital collections and your own digitization work without making mistakes and losing things? And once you've done this, just have a little think about the best method that for you. I mean, I personally go for digital because I don't have space for all the paperwork. But if you opt for paper, any digital files you have, just print them out, ring bind them, keep them all in one place. Digital's great because, as I said, it eliminates paper usage, which is great for saving the planet. It requires a lot less space, but just make sure you've got a good digital file management system. I like to think I'm relatively computer literate, but I always lose things. Always. I mean, if some of you saw my desktop, I think you'd think less of me. It's very crammed. So just make sure if you're doing it digitally, you've got a great filing system in place and it's not all on one device. That's another thing. You never know what might happen. Step two, I'd say just gather everything. Yeah. If it's all in paper, make sure it's stored together in chronological order or an order that helps you find things easier. And again, if you're doing it digitally, another thing to remember, if you're storing things digitally, try not to use kit that's incredibly out of date. You never know, certain updates can mean you could lose access to things. It's always a good idea to back up stuff at least somewhere, I think. Another thing is preserve family heirlooms, documents, and keepsakes. Loads of people were asking about this yesterday. What's the best way for preserving family keepsakes in kind of almost archival quality folders? And that's the answer. Yeah, buy archival quality, acid-free preservation storage folders and boxes. Store them in your home in a place that will be spared from extreme changes in temperature, humidity, and even light, really. So my top tips for here would be don't laminate. Don't laminate stuff. Laminating documents can cause documents to sweat. and that humidity can cause further deterioration, even if you think they're completely protected. Um, don't use staples, pins, paper clips. They may rust. That rust can seep into the documents and cause untold damage. Also, I think using staples, pins, paper clips is asking for tears. The same goes for sellotape. I would heartily advise against using sellotape. That's another amazing way of ripping your documents to shreds. And don't store really. I kind of say, yeah, don't store items if you can in lofts, cellars, or direct sunlight, because as we've touched on, they're they're susceptible to extreme changes in temperature, humidity, all those things that can wreak havoc with your precious physical documents. Also, don't over clean stuff. I know it's tempting to see something that might be in awful condition and think, well, I can get that looking good as new, but you can often do more damage than good. So if you do need something cleaning, maybe it's better to seek professional help if it's something really precious that you don't want to destroy. Good question. What can you use instead of sellotape? I didn't get that far, Victoria. I kind of I've got all mine on digital. My mum has that. My mum has everything stored, and you know those paper folders that are almost concertinaed. So when you open them, it's almost like an accordion, and there's an individual paper slot for each one. But if anyone's got any alternatives to sellotape, put them in the comments. I've just seen someone tuning in saying, "What's this?" Well, this is our Findmypast broadcast. We do these every Friday. We chat about family history. We've just had a look at some new records we've added to the site. We're currently looking at tips for storing your documents for better survivability and ways of better organising your. So I'm just watching the comments and getting a bit distracted, and basically keeping them safe. So a couple of things you should do. I'd say do encapsulate, store your documents and photographs in, as I've said, archive quality wallets. Use acid-free tissue paper, breathable cardboard boxes. All those things will prevent documents from getting humid. If you are going to use paper clips, use brass or plastic. Also, actually, no, I've got them in my notes. If you're not using sellotape, you can use repair tape. That's a viable alternative as well. Another thing as well, again, it's kind of the same as the don'ts, but choose a temperate area of your home to store this in, something that's fairly consistent, out of direct sunlight. It could be a pantry, it could be a cupboard. You'll know your own homes better. And if you do feel it's essential to remove dirt from, great, Rodney, thank you. Rodney saying 3 meter acid-free Scotch tape. Excellent recommendation. Cheers, Rodney. And if you do, what we're saying was, if you do feel the need, if you really feel you have to clean your documents, I'd say the only thing I recommend using is a very, very soft rubber, or perhaps even a brush to remove loose dirt. Don't be too vigorous. I know it's, if you really want to get rid of something, the temptations, you just put a little bit more pressure and see what you can do. But the next thing you know, the words will be gone from the page. Thomas McConnell, I can't believe I nearly forgot that one. Make color scans of all your documents. If you can, do it. That is a great, great tip. And I think, so those are my tips for kind of storing your documents. I don't know if any of you have heard of Jackie DePell. Jackie DePell is a brilliant family history speaker, and she's actually done a one-sheet to do and don't list on all the things you should and shouldn't do for storing items, and I'll pop that in the comments. It's a downloadable PDF, and I'll pop that in the comments after this broadcast, because it's a really fantastic summary. Before we look at Tom Hardy's family tree, I guess another thing I was thinking about is, if any of you don't read Family History magazine, check it out. Who Do You Think You Are? And Family History magazine. Family History magazine, there's a UK and a US version, full of amazing tips and daily sources of inspiration. Check them out. But I was reading Family History UK magazine this morning, and they had a lovely post from a couple of days ago on how to be a good future ancestor. Basically, when you're doing your research and you kind of almost cursing your great grandparents for not keeping things where you could easily find them. Well, they wrote a lovely post on how to prevent your descendants cursing your name and wishing you'd made life a little bit easy for them. So simple things you can do. If you've got any family photos, label them. Descendants you may never meet, I'm sure, will thank you for it in 100, maybe even 200-300 years' time. Every time you print a photo or save it to a digital collection, make sure you include the names and names of everyone depicted, dates at a minimum, maybe even include the location or the context. And if you get the chance, why don't you create a small collection of star photos where everybody is named and you can detail the relationships between each person? I mean, if we had access to this, I'm sure we'd jump for joy. Also, keep a diary. I mean, we're certainly living through interesting times now. And when we're looking at our ancestors' lives, we often have to rely on all these official documents and photos, which are great for essential names, dates, all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't tell you the stories. You're not hearing about their experiences in their own words. How amazing would it be if you were able to find a really detailed diary that your ancestors wrote? Some of you have it, but many of us don't. I wish I did. But think of your descendants. Keep a diary. You could chart your experiences during the COVID pandemic, how it affected your life, the changes, your family, all that kind of stuff. You could keep a diary of your own family history research. Another thing you could do is create a future family history collection. As Family Tree magazine has said, this could be a lovely activity for autumn. As the nights are drawing near, you could create a time capsule for your future descendants, storage boxes of photos, important papers, family trees you've worked up, the diary that you might, or even a gift you might want to leave those who come after you. Another things you could do is keep both offline and offline records. We've already touched on that to ensure your hard work doesn't disappear. Just make sure everything's backed up, but also precious originals from now. So birth certificates for yourself, your parents, your children, photos. Just make sure they're kept safe digitally. Back them up so people can access them in the future. And don't forget your family heirlooms. Do you have treasured items that have a story behind them? You know, a vase that belonged to your great-great-grandmother, or a carved chair that stood in your grandfather's farm cottage. If you have them, just make a note of the story behind them, so you know they're not flogged at an auction by someone who, in 100 years' time, who doesn't understand the incredible significance of them. Make sure they're protected and treasured, just in the way that you treasure them yourself by your descendants in the future. So those are my top tips. Anya's saying, find my past. It'd be worth getting someone from a museum to. Yes, that would be amazing. I'm sure Ali's going to be noting that down very keenly. I think that would be great. Amanda's saying, I've inherited all my maternal grandmother's diaries. Strange to read everyday accounts of my childhood. Yeah, that must be weird, but what a lovely thing to have. And now you can keep them for your descendants, and they'll be able to read might even be their great grandmother's experiences and accounts of your childhood. So we've got 10 minutes to go. I always do this. I always overstretch myself and don't leave myself with enough time. But before we go, let's take a very, very, very cursory glance at Tom Hardy's amazing family tree and why he should be an Egmore and not a Hardy. So Tom's family tree, his paternal side, is very much based in Norfolk. The Alan Partridge's, no, it's Norwich, I think, isn't it? Yeah, so Tom Hardy's family tree, or should I say Tom Egmore's family tree, very, very much based in Norfolk. In fact, Egmore, which is the name of his paternal line, is a very, very, very local name to Norfolk. I think it's based on. It's a very rare name as well, a very rare and distinctive Norfolk name that comes from the hamlet of Egmore, now called Egmere, which is between Fakenham and the coast. It's a tiny, quiet little village. And it's not that far from the aptly and wonderfully named village of Little Snoring. It's a great name, isn't it? And to give you an idea of what a small little hamlet it is, Egmore only had 47 people living in it in 1832. So it was a tiny little rural community. Anyway, so let's go back to as far as we've got. So we'll go back to Tom's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Nicholas Egmore, and Nicholas's son, Richard Egmore. So, as I said, story starts in Norwich in the mid-1700s. This is where the Egmore family, then spelt Egmore. Norfolk, England. Sorry, Jeanette West. This is Norfolk in England. This Tom Hardy's family come from. So The Egmore family then spelt E.G.G. Moore, but over time it was just shortened to E.G. Moore. They were living in Norwich, and they were a family of bricklayers and builders of quite some standing, actually. Nicholas Egmore started his apprenticeship. So this is Tom's Tom's 5 times great grandfather. Started his business, his apprenticeship when did he start? In 1769. And once he qualified, he trained up his son Richard in the trade. And Richard, his son, was the social climber. Richard surpassed his father in skill. In fact, he carried out some of his finest work in 1817 at Snittersham Old Hall, where he designed a grand entrance to the porch, the hall, the north staircase, iron balusters. Basically, he did a lot, and you can find it in payment records associated to work done by Richard Egmore, builder. But anyway, Richard was ambitious. He kind of overstepped a little bit, and despite his skill, sadly, he was declared bankrupt in 1825, while carrying on business as a builder and innkeeper. And he eventually turned his back on the building trade altogether and turned to a new trade, that of a coal merchant. So Richard, just to summarize, is Tom's 4 times great grandfather, the son of Nicholas Egmore. Tom's 5 times great grandfather. So he actually turned out to be very, very good at being a coal merchant, and kind of moved his family out of the working class to lower middle. I think that's fair to say. Relatively successful for some time, and there are actually still Egmores selling coal in Norwich to this day. So Richard had 2 daughters and a son born between 1807 and 1821. The son was baptized Randall Egmore. And as I said, Richard was very ambitious. He wanted better for his family, and he moved into speculating as a middleman, as a commission agent for the sale of coals. But this is where he, like previously with the building trade, he overreached himself again. He let down by his customers in 1843. He was forced to apply for bankruptcy, and he was ordered to travel to London to answer to the commissioner of the coal board, Joshua Evans, and this put Richard in a really bad place. This strain obviously took its toll, and by 1847, his wife died. His wife had died, and Richard followed him. Richard followed her a year later. So now we move on to Richard's son, Randall. Randall is Tom Hardy's great grandfather, and Randall had the interesting trade of being a hatter. And I don't think he was mad as a hatter, but you could say that the incredibly dangerous hatting trade maybe put him into an early grave. So when his father's coal business had been doing well, he'd earned enough money to let his son Randall move into this more genteel trade of a hatter, which in some ways was a lucky escape, because of course Richard would soon go bankrupt, and Randall was spared that. And of course, we've all heard the phrase "mad as a hatter." There's the Mad Hatter in C.S. Lewis's books, and that phrase was coined for very, very good reason. You probably know this already, but if you don't, hatters spent a lot of time in enclosed workshops treating beaver skins with mercury to give them this beautiful, beautiful glistening sheen. But unfortunately for them, it wasn't that well understood at the time, but the fumes from mercury are poisonous, but they take their time to do their work. So you basically have to be sitting in an enclosed space with mercury fumes over a prolonged period of time. And this could lead to bouts of madness and, in many instances, early death. So as well as being a hatter, Randall was a Methodist as well, but he was a Methodist preacher of the more politically active and dissenting variety. He was a deeply principled man. He lobbied for the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1845, and he basically, just to summarise, Corn Laws in 1845. At that time, there'd been obviously the famous failure of the potato crop in Ireland. Corn prices were being held artificially high to keep out cheap foreign imports of grain, and the combination of this crop failure and high prices for bread meant that the poor were starving, but corn merchants were becoming very, very rich. And Randall's religious and political conscience would just not let him rest in the face of such a terrible injustice. And he himself, of course, had witnessed the rapid demise of his father and mother after his father had become bankrupt. And that led him to take up the major step of quitting the hatting trade and devoting himself entirely to missionary work amongst the poor in Norwich. He became the superintendent of the Norwich City Mission for over a decade, from 1850 to the 1860s, and he was responsible for it was basically a very responsible and charitable job for a solid middle-class man of principle. So you can see in like 3 generations, the Egmores moved from being kind of working-class builders and bricklayers to respectable middle-class folk of some standing within their local communities, basically. So yeah, he spent his time with the poor of Norwich, preaching the gospel and bringing comfort to the sick and poor. But for all his good work, he died quite an early death. I think the hatting trade eventually caught up with him, and he sadly passed away aged just 48 in 1862. And this is where we get to my favourite part of the story. Tom's great-great-grandparents, Edward and Elizabeth. And out of all the ancestors in his tree, I think it's his ancestor Elizabeth Hardy, the lady who gave Tom his surname, is the one that maybe bears the closest resemblance personality-wise to Tom. Obviously, I don't know him personally, but from what I've read, Tom is a very determined, hard-working person, and he'll do anything to see justice is done. I don't know if any of you have heard that famous story where he single-handedly apprehended a mugger by parkouring over a building site in Richmond, and apparently it was like something from an action film, and he tackled this person down at great risk to himself, and his ancestor, his great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Hardy, was exactly the same. So basically, Edward Joseph Egmore was the eldest son of the Methodist minister, Randall. And as the eldest boy, he had a lot of responsibility put on him to keep the household finances above water after his father's early death. His mother worked as a school teacher to bring some money in, but Edward was really the one responsible for making money for his family, and he became a commercial traveling salesman selling stationery and other provisions. So he started off trying to do the right thing by his family, but this actually opened up a world of temptation that he hadn't known before as the son of a Methodist preacher. He was now this young, independent, self-relying, and arguably persuasive young man with money in his pocket, traveling to places where he wasn't known. And he thrived in this role, spending his 20s and 30s traveling and selling unmarried, staying in boarding houses in London, living a pretty carefree life with his wife and sisters back in Norfolk. And his younger brother was now off in the army. But this all changed in the summer of 1882, where a fateful encounter in a Norwich boarding house led to a series of events that led all the way down to the wonderful actor we now know and love today, Tom Hardy. So in the summer of 1882, Edward Egmore was traveling, selling his wares, and while staying in a boarding house in Norwich, he hooked up with a young housemaid by the name of Elizabeth Hardy. And sure enough, this very romantic liaison, led to Elizabeth soon becoming pregnant. And this was not what Edward wanted in life after years of after years of carefree travel and earning money. He didn't want this at all, and basically said so. And he told Elizabeth if she was going to have the baby, she would do it without his support. And you can see this on the birth certificate. Elizabeth left the father's name blank. But she was clearly intelligent and spirited, so she followed the common naming convention which was adopted by many single mothers in the 19th century, which was when the father's name is known but he wouldn't take responsibility for his child, the baby would be given the father's first name and surname, first name as a Christian name, surname as a middle name. So he became Edward Egmore Hardy. So Edward Egmore's son and the son of Elizabeth Hardy, Tom's great-grandfather was Edward Egmore Hardy. Hence why Tom is a Hardy and not an Egmore. But the story gets better there. So whatever pressure Elizabeth was putting on Edward, it obviously worked, because in 1883 he finally agreed to marry her. They were married in Norwich in 1883. Effectively legitimising their son, Edward Egmore Hardy. But the marriage was not a smooth sailing one. Although it was obviously not that bad because they did have another daughter the following year, Edward's wanderlust kicked in again, and he ended up abandoning his family in January 1884 and running off to Australia, where he landed in Victoria, traveling again as working again as a traveling salesman, exploring the country, doing his thing. And this is where Elizabeth was a real kind of tenacious, relentless, spirited, inspirational person, I think. She was left in an awful predicament. Her husband had ran off. She'd been abandoned. She was left to support her children on her own. But she didn't take this lying down. In September 1884, she took the remarkable step as a single woman on her own, traveling on her own steam all the way to Australia to track him down. She took her young baby daughter, but left the son, Tom's great grandfather, Edward Egmore Hardy, in England with relatives. Of course, this was a huge undertaking for a lone woman with a baby, let alone someone who probably never left Norwich before. But it also is a sign of her desperation that she was willing to leave her infant son, Edward Egmore, behind on this dangerous, journey into the unknown to track down her errant husband. And she was so determined to find him. She in 17th of September 1886, you can find this in our Australian record. She was able to persuade the Victoria police to put out a warrant for his arrest on the charge of desertion of his wife. And it worked. Edward was eventually located. He returned to Elizabeth, and the warrant was dropped. But it was interesting because it contains a physical description. So it describes Tom Hardy's great great grandfather as having a slight build, not like his descendant then, who's quite beefy, fair complexion, brownish hair, a broken nose with a moustache, and wearing a black coat, light trousers, and a boxer hat. So I'll read that again and see if you can imagine Tom Hardy. He had a fair complexion, brownish hair, a broken nose with a moustache, wearing a black coat, light trousers, and a boxer hat. So the couple lived for a while in Geelong, Victoria. They had 5 more children in 1889 and 1894, including twins, 3 boys, girls, all that kind of stuff. But their eldest son, Edward Egmore Hardy, was never fetched. He was left in England in the care of his nephews, which is why, thankfully, Tom Hardy was born in Britain and became the actor he is. So I just find that was a fascinating story. All these different things, that specific events and twists of fate that led to Tom Hardy being born. So he should have been an Egmore, but if it wasn't for the actions of his wayward great great grandfather, he was a Hardy. He became a Hardy, and if he wasn't left behind, if he was also taken to Australia, he would have. If his great grandfather wasn't left behind and taken to Australia with his mother, who knows? Tom could have been born in Australia or not born at all, and never would have become the Hollywood star we know and love. So I hope you enjoyed that. There is actually a blog post on our blog going into a little bit more detail. And I've noticed I'm 3 minutes over schedule, so massive thanks to everybody who stayed with me for the full hour and a bit. I'm going to have a quick look. Linda Debbie, one of my relatives worked on a film starring Tom Hardy. He now counts him as a friend, or you can pass on. If Tom is ever interested in his roots, he should get in touch with Findmypast. We'd be very, very happy to tell him. So I'm going to have a quick look at some comments. Amanda White, I found out this year through DNA that grandfather wasn't who I thought, but an American GI. Wow. The family can trace their line back to William Bradford from the Mayflower. Also, my 4 times great-grandfather defended and died at the Alamo. Oh, those are some great stories. Alamo Ancestors is a good one. Valerie A. Wilson said, my gran told me that we were related to Bonnie Prince Charlie. I have not proven this yet. That's a project for the winter then, isn't it? I have not, in my research, I've found that my 7 times great aunt is Jackie Crookston, who was killed at the Tranent Massacre. Her statue was put up in 1995, the year I moved here. A point of interest, the boy in the statue is not relative and was added only to provide stability. Wow, okay. That is fascinating. I always love it. It's great to see that so many people make so many amazing discoveries on a regular basis. Amanda Webb said, that's one of the reasons I love family history. What choices, events in my ancestors' lives mean I'm here today. Totally agree. It's those kind of sliding doors, what if moments that make it so interesting. Sean Beatty, never heard of Tom Hardy before. What? He's so famous. He's in loads of things. I'm pretty sure you will have seen some films with him in. Um, Oh, thank you, Peggy. Glad you enjoyed it. Cheryl, I have a first cousin twice removed on my tree who was born in Middlesbrough, Yorkshire. Her family had a lodger for a year who was born in Grenada, British West Indies. My relative married him in 1902 and they moved to Winnipeg, Canada. They have 5 children. The Canadian census lists him as Black West Indian and her is white British. I often wonder how they are accepted by the society of their day. Yeah, and things, reflections like that are, other important reasons for why we explore things like Black History Month and why it's interesting to evaluate how things like race, identity, and things have been viewed differently throughout history. And shockingly, sometimes we find our ancestors were, in some cases, more progressive than we are today. But obviously, that's not always the case. But I think on that note, I can see people are starting to peel off because we have been chatting for a while, but I'm going to leave you to it. I'm going to wish you all a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thanks as always for everybody who's tuned in, commented, joined the conversation. I really do love doing these. It's the highlight of my week. You're all marvelous. And we will see you again very soon. Stay safe, stay in touch, stay connected, and all the best of luck in your research. I hope you continue to make wonderful discoveries like the ones that have been shared today. And I hope you've all learned something, especially from all the wonderful tips and tricks you've all been sharing with each other on storing and archiving your research. So yeah, can't say thanks enough. This has been great. I've loved it. And I will see you all very, very soon. Have a wonderful weekend.